Hey, Psych fam. Just reflecting on some of the stuff we've been working with. I know a lot of you are seniors, and we're getting to the point of the year where you're we're kind of wrapping things up. I'm not wrapping things up, kids. I've really got nothing else, so I'm here for you. I'll keep these things going. If these are in any way helpful to you, I try to make these videos so there's something that you could walk the dog for 25, 30 minutes and listen to them and learn some psychology. That's kind of been my modus operandi for this whole process. And look, we have extenuating circumstances, and many of you have been doing just an amazing job on the articles. And those articles, remember, man, those are, except for the last one I gave you, which is a really important article to what we're talking about. Um, you know, those articles, pick something you really like, and something that you're fascinated in. What would I love? I would love 100 students becoming psychotherapists, or earning their master's or PhD in psychology and using it to help people. And we'll get into, we're going to be moving in eventually to the breakdown of the psyche, and that's where you can really help people. Anyway, I gave you an article that dealt with the groundbreaking studies at Johns Hopkins regarding their use of psilocybin on a number of. Johns Hopkins has been using psilocybin for a while. Actually, before I get there, let me explain a little something, because the article doesn't go into the what's going on, and the what's going on with this class of drug called hallucinogens. And these are the drugs that, when we're looking at altered states of consciousness, obviously all drugs alter the state of consciousness in some way. But when we get to psychoactive drugs or hallucinogens, they act differently than other drugs act. And and I'll go into what's happening, but more importantly, the reason we spend time on these is because since the 1950s and 60s, since Albert Hofmann created LSD, and remember that naturally occurring things like psilocybin and ayahuasca, which is a DMT plant, and even, well, LSD is a fungus, but these things have been around for a very long time. The notion of the Greek oracles being high, the notion of, I've read stuff about the Essenes, the religious mystics in the time of Christ were using these things. Certainly the shaman have used peyote for a very long time. Rastafarianism has embraced a hallucinogen known as marijuana. So they've played a role that wasn't a partying role. And that's, I think, the reason. Of course, these drugs have been misused for purposes of, going to raves in the 90s. I remember the MDMA years. I don't even think that the drug was illegal back then. Go Gators. But, the raving and this, that, and the recreational element of these drugs I get it. I understand where people are coming from there. But from a psychology perspective, I hate that side of these because they detract from the really amazing potentialities that some of these drugs have. Okay? And I'll go into some of those. And that article I gave you kind of went into the potentiality and the pioneers of this. And I have been talking about it with my psych classes for about 15 years, since the early 2000s, about the Johns Hopkins experiments. And I'll get into those. What we're dealing with these psychoactive drugs we're dealing essentially with agents of disorganization. Now, most of these drugs, act on the 2A receptors or 2AR receptors, 2A, 2AR, 2A receptors in the brain, what happens is they mimic the action of they're able as an agonist to get into a serotonin receptor, and your body is flooded with serotonin. Right? And one of the things that we have learned is they act deep in the cortex. Your cortex has 6, 7 layers, and the closest to the top is 1, and then as you get down level 5 of the cortex is where most of these psychoactive drugs work. And this is important because this is the area that does most of it maintains the rhythm and oscillation of your thought processes. And it essentially it kind of confuses these. And so your brain, neurons and neural network, the oscillation is disrupted, so signals are disrupted. So when the rhythm and oscillation of neural impulses are disrupted, right, then what happens is the brain kind of starts to go out on starts to act, what's the word I'm looking for? Unconstrained. There's this unconstrained brain activity. Now, that level 5, when we're acting down there, we have this decrease in brain activity in the thalamus, the posterior cortex, posterior singular cortex, which is vision-based, and the prefrontal cortex, which of course is information and integration and routing. Like all of those processes, okay, are processes. So what's happening here is the thalamus and the posterior singular cortex and the prefrontal and the prefrontal cortex, because they are their functions are decreased, the brain is sort of unconstrained. And so this accounts for the imagery and the confusion. It's very important to point out that the psychoactive drugs cause hallucinations. Now, by and large, the safety of psychoactive drugs, as we are seeing with Johns Hopkins, the safety is pretty good in a clinical environment. But if you are someone who has schizophrenia, although they have been trying to treat schizophrenia with these, but again, let me just put a caveat out there. Everything you read about or everything I'm talking about is about the clinical use of these drugs, not recreational use of these drugs. It can't come off as my endorsing, because I am very excited by the prospect of many of the studies that are coming out about psychoactive drugs and their effect on depression and anxiety and things like PTSD. Because I'm excited about that, I'm not excited about the use of these in a recreational, setting. That's, that's dangerous. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's not going to happen, but it's a much more dangerous prospect. When you're at Hopkins or in a clinical setting at CU, in their psychology department, because everybody's doing research with this stuff now. When you're in a clinical setting, they can control the effect. And that's very important, because things, the quote unquote bad trip is a very real thing. When you have an unconstrained brain, when you have unconstrained brain function, when you have the thalamus, and you have your posterior cortex and prefrontal cortex unconstrained, there's potential for real problems and some really dark stuff, especially if you buy into the idea that you are looking at elements of the unconscious when using one of these drugs. So the main drugs that we're talking about are lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, which we actually now think may have had something to do with the Salem witch trials. That might be urban. I mean, I heard that in college, in grad school, but it was the ergot fungus on wheat, and the women were working with the wheat and they essentially tripped. That's what the LSD is a derivative of that. Albert Hofmann, the Swiss scientist, I believe in the 40s, developed LSD, and then I think we have this thing called World Bicycle Day, which celebrates the day he rode his bicycle home after taking LSD. That's some of the urban stuff. That might be real. That might not be real. I wouldn't share it, if I didn't think there was some truth to that. I know Albert Hofmann self-administered LSD to see what he had come up with. At that point, to continue with LSD, Timothy Leary and his partner. I know that. What was his partner's name? Begins with an R. Anyway. The two of them at Harvard, in the psychology department, will sort of, in the 60s, grab hold of the Hoffman LSD stuff, and they will start to use it themselves. Now, Ken Kesey, the writer of Cuckoo's Nest, at the same time as Timothy Leary in Harvard, is doing this stuff out at Cal Berkeley, but he's a writer. I don't even think he's a student. I'm pretty sure he volunteered for an experiment at an insane asylum. By the way, that is not good psychology nomenclature. A house for mental illness, a psychiatry treatment center, not an insane asylum. That's not good. Anyway, so Leary on one coast and Kesey on the other coast, and they are tripping. And there's a book by Tom Wolfe called The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, which chronicles Ken Kesey's bus called the Further Bus, in which he had these acid tests. And the Grateful Dead were actually the house band at his acid tests. And I guess he would have these giant parties or concerts, and he would distribute acid. That's how readily acid was available in the 60s. Well, the point of this whole, and by the way, Leary, Neil Cassidy from Jack Kerouac's On the Road was the driver of Kesey's bus. Tom Wolfe's Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test is a really cool book. If you get a chance to read it, it's a great book about the 60s. He also wrote the Pump House Rules, which is an amazing book. I love a lot of Tom Wolfe's stuff. His modern stuff's amazing. Anyway, where were we? So we were at Cassidy driving Casey's bus cross country. There's this great scene where they don't even know they're driving through the forest fires, and they get pulled over by a cop, and everybody on the bus is on acid. Don't mean to glorify it, but it's a good book. It's a really good book. So anyway, so that's where the drugs started getting heavily abused. Now, you could say Casey and Leary, their intent wasn't abuse. They really, this disorganized element enabled them to see the world as a unity. That was the big thing coming out of both camps, the Casey camp and the Leary camp, was they saw the world as a unity. Now, that's important because when we look at the experiments at Johns Hopkins, you'll see something very similar. But LSD and all of these hallucinogens will be classified as class 1 drugs, which is the most illegal of the drugs, because they quote unquote have the highest potential for abuse. That's class 1. And there are drugs like cocaine, which are, I think, class 2 or 3. And so that part is pretty silly. Marijuana is class 1 too. So I think that one of the really good things about what we're doing here on a clinical level is we are showing that despite the fact that these drugs are shouldn't be used recreationally, we can't disqualify them simply because Casey and Leary created entire movements of kids. And I would be, if I'm the government, I'm spooked by the number of kids in San Francisco and New Jersey and everywhere else dropping acid in 1964, 65. Like, the government was kind of freaked out, like, man. It also brought up, this is Vietnam too, by 68, and the government, at this point, the government is like, we can't have, people, dropping acid and possibly seeing, anti-government propaganda in their head, whatever. I don't mean to get all conspiracy theorist on you, but class 1, it seems a bit harsh for something that really, even at the time, when Timothy Leary first started using and advocating this stuff, he was actually using it on things like depression, and he was looking at how this affected people's well-being in life. So he was doing some real experimentation. Sorry, I'm rambling, but take your dog for a long walk and listen to this. So you also have MDMA, which is an amphetamine, but it does produce hallucinogenic properties. It's serotonin and dopamine there. Ayahuasca, which is a DMT, a plant that activates the release of DMT in your system, and very hallucinogenic. Ayahuasca, there are ayahuasca retreats in Peru. There's even ayahuasca retreats in Boulder. I mean, it's getting more and more accepted because we have demonstrated some pretty good informal data about the use of this for things like depression and anxiety. Peyote, which is a mescaline derivative from a cactus. I believe the movie Young Guns, I think they were using peyote. 1994, Emilio Estevez, Charlie Sheen, what's his name? Whatever, man, I'm just rambling. Top Gun, Val Kilmer, the Young Guns, like a Western. I think John Bon Jovi's in it. He sings the Blaze of Glory. He sings the, whatever, man. I think they're on an Indian reservation, and they use peyote. It might have been mushrooms. which is a psilocybin, which is another one, and mushrooms. The psilocybin is the article that I read. That is the primary drug that Johns Hopkins has been using. Hopkins is our oldest medical research facility. It's the best med school in the country, and it was important for Hopkins to do the psilocybin research because they had the credibility to start doing the research. And what they started to do was they first did experiments. They created a psychoactive department within their psychology department, and they started administering psilocybin to people for cigarette and nicotine addiction and for depression. And the results, as you read, were very good. 80% of the people that they admit that were depressed, they administered a single dose, and it is something like a year later, 80% reported much less depression. Cigarettes, same number, 80%. A year later, and I think the people that when they tested the cigarettes, I think they gave multiple doses over a period of time. But again, 80% reported very strong results and not smoking afterwards. I think I know that they have done work with cancer patients, both terminal cancer patients and non-terminal cancer patients, to non-terminal, because a positive outlook is very important to success rate and recovery rate. So they feel like by giving certain people psilocybin, and if they can get this 80% life well-being positivity level up in a cancer patient, it will help them recover. And in terminal patients, they're using it to enable them to grasp and identify more metaphysically with the dying process. So it's not an anxiety-ridden process, but a process of understanding. 85% of the people in the original depression study at Hopkins recognized and reported psilocybin, their trip at Hopkins, as the most meaningful event in their lives. So, what's happening with this? Well, we understand some of it. We understand that your brain it's an unconstrained brain function due to the fact that at that freaking level 5 of the cortex, it's almost like we are kind of the best example I've ever seen in terms of what is happening deep down in your cortex at that level 5 is if we were all clapping in unison, and then you took people, a selective group of people, and had them sort of clap out of unison, it would disrupt the entire orchestra. Use an orchestra or whatever. Because I'm not that great with biology. I've had the biology that most of you have had, a little more in grad school because of the psych stuff, but that's the best explanation that I've heard. I mean, when we're talking about the thalamus and the posterior cingulate cortex and the prefrontal cortex, I don't expect you to really completely understand that, but this is where our information integration and routing occurs. So by disrupting the information integration and routing, okay, the brain works on an unconstrained level. And this disruption is due to the fact that we're acting on those 2A receptors. So, the one thing that they are starting to find that is revelatory in a new, something I have not read before, and I'm just starting to read about lately, is the increased system level flexibility of the neural pathways in the brain and the potentiality of recircuiting, because of that flexibility, the brain. So that people with depression, the brain is actually, because they're creating a flexibility in your brain, you are rerouting neural networks to eliminate things like depression and anxiety. Because what happens is neural networks lead to entrenched behavior. So if for your entire life you have been riddled with depression or anxiety, that has created neural networks. And so as you get older, brain flexibility declines. What the psilocybin allegedly might be doing, and what these other drugs might be doing, is increasing the flexibility so that you can create new neural network systems. Anyway, there's a lot of potential here. And by the way, the effects are pretty interesting. You see and hear and taste and feel things that are hallucinatory. So they're not there. Your brain is creating them, and it's acting on your physiology, so you actually can hear them, you can see them, you can feel them, but they're not there. There's a lot of danger with this. If you are schizophrenic, if you have schizophrenia in your family, these drugs can only be administered in a clinical setting. Okay, because they have to be able to take you out of this experience. Look, all this should be done in a clinical setting. I don't want to see these drugs ruined the way they were in the 60s by abuse. They have so much promise for things like depression, anxiety, and PTSD that I don't want to see them ruined. So, long and short of it, hallucinogens, tremendous potential. I hope you read the article. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. I kind of rambled on. I'm sorry. I read a lot about these things. And whether I synthesize the science properly, I don't know. But you that go on to study, get your medical degree, and then go on to psychiatry, you call me and you can explain to me what I got wrong and how my brain is not functioning properly. Anyway, but in all fairness, I'll just blame COVID because I have done nothing but read and ride my bicycle the whole time. That is all I'm doing, and that means I'm just, oh God, kids. Anyway, there's no assignment with this. Just take the dog for a long walk, listen to this, and research it more if you're interested. Anyway, miss you, love you, and be well.